I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to part 2 of lecture 3 on moral conventionalism. In the first part, right, the first video, we discussed his notion of the state of nature, sort of that beginning point, life without societies, civilizations, and governments in place, right, basically a state of anarchy. We talked about why that was such a nasty scenario for Hobbes. Again, all based on this underlying pessimistic view of human nature. Of course, we talked about that at length as well. And then we talked about why the state of nature is not such a pretty picture for him, and we talked about then this impetus or reason for us getting out. Okay, and so and of course that was the impetus then for the emergence and institution of governments, societies, and civilizations. Right. So now we're going to turn our attention to that process of getting out of the state of nature and talk about that in a little bit more detail. We'll get into here first then distinguish between what he means by rights versus laws, and then we'll get into the so-called laws of nature and talk about them in more detail. Okay, and the laws of nature, as we'll see, are kind of the rational steps that he thinks are necessary to get out of the state of nature. Okay, so what does he mean by rights, and what does he mean by laws? Rights, and we alluded to this in the first video for this lecture. Right? We have that right to everything. Right? What does that mean? A right for him means an ability or freedom to do something, right? So if we have a right to everything, it means we have the freedom or ability to do whatever we want. Okay? So remember, that was the problem in the state of nature, is that, not that I have the right to everything, but you guys all have the right to everything. That's the problem, okay? Because I can't trust you guys, so says Hobbes, right? So rights are the ability or freedom to do what we want, right? Or the ability to do something. So if I have a right to everything, that means I have the freedom or ability to do whatever I want. Remember the right of nature. He references this right of nature. That's our freedom or ability to do whatever is necessary to survive. Okay? No matter what, he says, we always ought to have that right of nature, that freedom or ability to do whatever is necessary to ensure our survival. A law, on the other hand, is a kind of a rational rule, something you have to do in order to get something you want, in order to attain something. So I think an important facet of this concept of a law for him and others, as we'll see, there's similarities to how he thinks about a law and how, like, Immanuel Kant thinks about a law. We'll talk more about him way down the road later in the course, but we've mentioned Kant a few times, right? He talks about laws too, and there's, it's important for most of these guys that talk about laws in this way, right? The idea is that it's a rational process, right? It's spelling out something that's necessary. So fortunately, we're in this state of nature, right? It's a really crappy scenario, but fortunately, we have these brains, right? This ability to reason. We have this rational capacity, this ability to reason and to think about what we need to do to get the heck out, right? This place sucks. It's a constant state of war and fear. Well, how do we get out? Well, our rational capacity is what allows us to figure out what's necessary. So it's a very rational process for Hobbes. So I think it's important to note that. Okay, so laws are discovered by reason. It's something that's rational in nature. And it's spelling out kind of what's necessary in order to get something that you want. So it's sort of spelling out a rule that you have to follow in order to attain something. Okay? So turning our attention then to slider page 16, going back, right, the state of nature stinks. Remember, in the state of nature, everyone has the right to everything. That's not good because of the reasons we talked about, right? Because you can't trust anyone else. Okay, so that absolute freedom or that right to everything leads to a constant state of war and fear, a sense of fear and then constant state of war. And we don't want any of that. So look, we're in this situation, Hobbes says. Fortunately, we have our ability to think. I don't want war, this constant state of war. What do I need to do to avoid that then? And it's so straightforward, it almost seems like it should go without saying, but what's the first rational step? If I don't want war, seek peace, right? Seek the opposite. And then he says, live within its constraints. So the first law of nature, right? You're in this crappy situation where it's basically a war of all against all. Well, seek the opposite. Seek peace and live within its constraints. Okay? And I think that's right out of the book. That comes from page 188. I'm pretty sure it's exactly how it words it. Every person ought to seek peace and live within its constraints. The general idea, right, is that we have to seek the opposite and do whatever is necessary to get the opposite, right? We don't want that constant state of fear and the war of all against all, so we need to do whatever is necessary to attain the opposite. We need to seek peace, the opposite, and live within its constraints, whatever is necessary to have it. Okay? And so In fact, the subsequent laws, and there's many of them, we're only going to highlight the first two, they kind of build off one another. In fact, so it almost, you can almost say, is entailed by the first law, right? So if we want to seek peace and live within its constraints, put on our thinking caps, using our rational capacity. Well, what's going to be necessary? What rule do we have to follow, or what's the rational step that's going to be necessary to seek peace, right? What's going to be, what was, in other words, what was the problem initially, right? What's going to be the necessary element to get peace? What was the problem that led to the war? Well, it was that absolute freedom, right? That right to everything we had. So to seek peace, right, to get the opposite, we're going to have to, right? What's the next rational step? Forfeit our right to everything. That was the problem, right? So agree, all of us, right, not to do whatever we want, right? So now, again, so that second law of nature is forfeit our right to everything. Careful here, don't make the rookie mistake. Again, you guys are all rookies because you're new to philosophy for the most part, right? When he says forfeit our right to everything, that does not mean forfeit all of our rights, right? We're not giving up all of our freedoms, right? No, it means that general sense, or as he puts it, our right to everything, right? Our general ability or absolute freedom, right, to do whatever we want to. No, we're forfeiting that. We can't do whatever we want anymore, but we can still do stuff, right? We still have some rights, some freedoms, okay, but we don't have a right to everything anymore. Okay, so we have to forfeit that right to everything. That's the second law of nature. Okay. Turning to slide or page 18. Now there's a very, very important caveat here. This all makes sense. This is all rational, and it behooves us. It's in our own interest. That's the sense in which it's rational, right? Because reason for Hobbes, like many egoists, boils down to facilitating our own self-interest. So it's rational. It facilitates our self-interest. It makes sense for us to follow these laws of nature, right? To seek peace and live within its constraints, and in doing so, right, to forfeit our right to everything, to not do whatever we want, to not murder, rape, enslave others, steal their bananas and Guinness, and so on, right? To not do all that. That all makes sense if or provided what? So there's a huge caveat here, right? So long as everyone else is also on board. So long as you are not the only one subscribing to these laws of nature, right? Provided everyone else is on board as well and are also following the laws of nature. Then they make sense. Okay, but if you are the only one, you know, seeking peace and living within its constraints, which amounts to forfeiting your right to everything. If you're the only one doing that and everyone else is still doing whatever they want, obviously that's going to be far from furthering your own interests. It's actually going to be counter to your own interests. It's going to, right, diminish your interests. It's going to hurt you. Okay, so huge caveat. Look, others have to be, fulfilling, right, their obligations as well, forfeiting their right to everything and so on. So here he's highlighting our right to our right of nature, right? We always have the ability, or we ought to, right, always do whatever's necessary to survive. So, in other words, if acknowledging that caveat, if others aren't also following along with these laws, then look, you have every right to then go back, revert back to the state of nature tactics, engage in war, engage in conflict. By all means, stop abiding by, they no longer make sense, right? So you should no longer be forfeiting your right to everything if nobody else is. Okay? You should always do whatever necessary to survive, right? So if other people aren't abiding by the laws of nature as well, then it doesn't make sense for you to. Okay? So how does he put it? And there's a really good quote here I have. So this is what he's going to have. Bottom, I think, is on page 188 here. Quote, if other men will not lay down their right, which is what you're doing, right, in this process here, then there is no, as well as he, then there is no reason for anyone to divest himself of his, right? So it only makes sense if everyone's doing. Okay, that was on page 188. Okay, so I think that, that makes sense. Okay, so these are rational and make sense. They're in your own interest, provided everyone is on board. Okay, if that's the case, everybody goes along with it. Well, then we've escaped the state of nature. Granted, we won't be able to do quite as much stuff, right? We won't have that absolute freedom. We won't have that right to everything, right? But we'll actually have some security now. We won't be fearful quite as much, at least. We won't be experiencing that constant state of war like we were in the state of nature, or so says Hobbes. Okay, so turning to page or slide 19, just wanted to mention here real quick, right, that we've already highlighted this concept, and we'll highlight it more in the next lecture as well when we get to Locke. This idea, right, that this is a social contract. So in this process, we're forming, if you will, a social contract, an agreement of sorts. And John Locke is also a social contract here. So Thomas Hobbes John Locke, arguably, the most famous social contract theorists. They're known as social contract theorists, and you can kind of see, the idea of how a social contract is at work here, right? Again, we're getting out of the state of nature. We come together. We make these agreements, right? These concessions. I agree not to do certain things to you, and you make a similar agreement not to do them to me, right? And in that process, the idea is we're forming a contract, right? We're making an agreement, a social contract. Okay. And for Hobbes, not for Locke, okay, because Locke does believe in a natural sense of justice. So we alluded to, some important differences between them. We already highlighted in the first part of the first video for this lecture, their difference in their underlying view of human nature. Locke is much more optimistic. Okay, but he also believes, contrary to Hobbes, Locke also believes in a natural sense of justice. And I'll talk more about that in the Locke lecture. But remember, for Hobbes, no, there's no natural sense of justice. If we're back in the state of nature, for Hobbes, right, there's no such thing as right and wrong. Force and fraud keep you alive longer. Those are actually great things in the state of nature. Okay, so it's only right upon the institution of the social contract that for Hobbes we even gain finally some semblance of morality. Right? So I just want to point that out too, right? Because we are here for moral philosophy, right? For Hobbes, it's at this point when we've instituted the social contract that we actually get a viable sense of morality. Not for Locke. Locke thinks that we had a sense of morality back in the state of nature, but again, they're both social contract theorists. And for Hobbes, when we finally institute that social contract, is when we finally get that idea of morality, a sensible idea of morality in the first place. Turning to page 20 or slide 20. I wanted to highlight, again, so related to this idea of the social contract, tying that together with his, remember, Hobbes' underlying pessimism. Oh boy, pessimism, that's way off probably. You marry those two together, right, this idea of the social contract with his underlying pessimistic view, and you're going to see then the reasons why he takes pains to emphasize a few things, right? So we're going to talk about what I'm getting at here is his suggestion that we need a very coercive power, a very powerful sovereign in place to mete out punishment for not abiding by the social contract. So remember, we come together, we agree not to do certain things, but remember for Hobbes, right, given his underlying pessimistic view of human nature, you can't trust people, right? So we'll make all kinds of agreements, but if we can, we'll try to weasel our way out of them and get away with stuff, right? So the best ideal scenario, right, for the ultimate egoist is to make all kinds of fanciful agreements and then to still, snakily get other stuff as well, right, in the process, right? So whatever we get, in other words, whatever we can get away with, we're going to try to get away with. And so recognizing that, okay, you can't just have a contract and make all these agreements. You have to have some means by which to ensure that the contract will be fulfilled, right? Be abided by. And hence, that's then the need for the powerful sovereign. Again, probably not the right spelling, apologize for that. Powerful sovereign is needed to ensure that we actually do what we say we're going to do. Again, that goes back to his view of us, right? That we're not trustworthy at a basic level. So without powerful sovereign in place, we're going to have these agreements made, but then nobody's going to follow them. Okay. Okay. Blah blah blah. So, and here's another famous quote. Again, supporting what we were just saying here, right? This is the way Hobbes himself makes the point. This is on page 190 of the textbook. He says, quote, "Covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. They're meaningless, more or less, on his account, right? If you just make agreements without instituting any means to make sure that they're fulfilled, they're practically worthless for him, given human nature again and how untrustworthy we are. But again, take somebody else, maybe somebody like Locke, maybe our word is all we need, right? Maybe most of us are trustworthy, but not for Hobbes, right? No, you're going to need an all-powerful sovereign in place. Basically, in fact, it would be better off, it seems like, under Hobbes, and we'll get more into this when we get into the next lecture on Locke and juxtapose those two. It would seem like, excuse me, we'd in fact be better off under a dictator, some sort of malevolent tyrant, right, who is extremely powerful, we'd still almost be better off in that situation than we would be back in the state of nature. It seems like, according to Hobbes, again, given his very dreary view of our underlying human nature, because at least we have some sense of expectation still within, that social contract. Granted, it can be much better. Right back in the state of nature, there's a ever-present, constant sense of fear and dread and worry of survival. Right? So I want to point that out, right? That even in the worst possible seeming scenario in terms of a government being in place, sovereign being in place, it seems like that it's still better in Hobbes' mind than the state of nature. That's how bad the state of nature is. Now, Locke would never agree with that. In fact, that gets at the real difference between him and Hobbes in terms of why so many more Americans, are familiar with Locke as opposed to Hobbes, because Locke says, no, in fact, there are several instances where social contracts can be terrible, and you're better off rebelling, revolting against the sovereign, right, that's overseeing such contracts. If they're terrible, if they're not, seeing to your interest, revolt. Don't stay with such a sovereign. Whereas Hobbes says, no, you're better off, not revolting, even if it's a terrible tyrant. It's still way better in that situation than going back to state of nature. Well, can you tell why then the founding fathers of the United States latched onto Locke as opposed to Hobbes? Well, that's why, right? Because Locke is justifying revolution, whereas Hobbes isn't. Okay? And that again goes back to their fundamental disposition to human nature, right? Locke is not the pessimist Hobbes is. We go back to state of nature, it's not going to be as dreary as Hobbes says. That's why it's better to get out of a crappy government and revolt against the government and go back to state of nature for Locke, right, than it is to stay in too powerful a sovereign that's neglecting your interest, turning into a tyrant. The state of nature for Locke could be much better than that situation. But for Hobbes, that's not the case at all. And again, that goes back to his very, very pessimistic underlying view of human nature. Okay, so quick summary of Hobbes' view, and then we'll let you go, and we'll move on to Locke in the next lecture. Okay, so it's reasonable. So this is 21, slide 21. It's reasonable to cooperate so long as that cooperation, this is the major point that we just got finished hammering home. So long as that cooperation can be sufficiently enforced, right? It makes sense to cooperate, to come together, to form a contract, so long as we can ensure that everybody's following those laws of nature and following the contract in general, right? Which is why we need that, right? The powerful sovereign. So we give up our freedom, right? Remember, this is all egoistic in nature. We're giving our freedom supposedly for our own self-interest. Well, why is that? How is that? Because then we get some greater semblance, finally some tangible sense of security on Hobbes' account. We never had any sense of security back in the state of nature. Forfeiting our right to everything, right, that we have in the state of nature. By doing that, all of us together, we come together, right, and we finally have some degree of comfort. Okay. Now, granted, we're still locking our chests within our doors, right? Even when we have police and a government in place, we still lock our doors. Granted, that's the case. We're still way better off than we were in the state of nature. Now, somebody out there says, I don't lock my doors. And I say, well, what's your address? And I'll post in the forums, right? So to Hobbes' point, right, we're all still locking our doors. There's still that underlying mistrust, right? So you kind of wonder, I like that debate. And so I think there's one of the questions, is human nature really as selfish, right, as Hobbes suggests? Now, again, Locke doesn't think that's the case. I really get into that debate. I think that's interesting. Are we really, on a whole, now when you're approaching those questions, by the way, obviously there's going to be some for whom Hobbes is right and some for whom Locke's right? So, I mean, some are not trustworthy, some are, right? But on a whole, right, in general, do you think Locke tends to be more correct? Are people on a whole fairly sympathetic towards one another, want one another to cooperate? Or on a whole, does Hobbes tend to be correct, right? In general, are most people just concerned with their own interests? In general, most people take the bananas if they knew they wouldn't get punished for doing so, right? Remember that example that we talked about? I think that was the last video, right, where I mentioned Hobbes and Locke. There's resources over there. Your stuff, right? Your packs of bubble gum or your bottles of water are over there. I can take them. Nobody's going to see me take them. Am I going to take them? Hobbes says, heck yeah, you are. right? Or 99% of us, right? Granted, there's going to be exceptions, right? On a whole, are most of us going to take that stuff? Or is Locke right to say, no, look, if we're not dying of thirst or hunger, we're not going to go and hoard the goods just because we can and because we get away with it? No, we want to flourish together. We're more sympathetic and want to cooperate. So says Locke, right? So that gets into, again, some of these questions, which I think are interesting. And I think it would help you, what I was trying to say there, it would be helpful as you're approaching those questions to grant and acknowledge, hey, look, there's going to be some for whom Locke's right and some for whom Hobbes is right? But then approach it in a more general sense, right? On a whole, do people tend to be more like Locke says, or does Hobbes tend to be more correct? Okay, so anyway, blah, blah, blah. I guess the only other point, going back to slide 21, I pretty much said it all, right, to sum it up. Just remember, in Hobbes' sense of morality, it's a convention, it's something we create. It only emerges in the first viable sense once we've created that contract, right? With the emergence of the social contract, and so too the concomitant government that's with it, we finally have our sense of morality. And what is that sense of morality for Hobbes? Right comes to mean abiding by the laws, right? And wrong comes to mean disobeying the laws. Or, in other words, in a more general sense, abiding by the social contract or not abiding by the social contract. That's what right and wrong comes to mean. Okay? And it's moral conventionalism in the sense that morality is something we are creating ourselves because, as we've discussed, right, it furthers our own interests. Okay? It's something we're creating to help us survive and flourish. Okay? I think that's it. Again, hopefully you kind of enjoy this stuff. We're starting to get into the theory, the theory stuff, and we left the logic and the general intro stuff behind. So we got our first real theory here, moral conventionalism. So hopefully you're getting into it. Hopefully, again, Hobbes, it's kind of making sense now. I know that Old English can be pretty tricky and difficult to digest, but hopefully it all makes sense. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, don't forget to post your post in the forum to one of these questions, whether it be the intermission questions or the reflection time questions at the end. Until next time, see you later.